Chapter 9. I Learn of the House of Kernus. Who, too, the keeper, as Elizabeth has suggested, was only too willing to show me all around the house of Kernus. He was pleased with the size and complexity of the operation, which was indeed impressive. It was, of course, the largest and most opulent of the slave houses in R. The house of Kernus was more than 30 generations old. It had bred slaves as well as handled them for more than 25 generations. The breeding lines of the house of Kernus were recognized with those of the house of Portus and certain others of the large slave houses throughout known Gaul. To a slaver, certain girls can be recognized at a glance as being of certain varieties developed by certain houses. The primary goals of the programme, of course, wherever found, are beauty and passion. On the other hand, considering the large number of slaves on Gaul, only a small fraction are carefully bred. A larger fraction is bred, but more haphazardly, as when a given male of one of the private houses is mated for a price with a given female of another house. Often in these matters, conducted under supervision, both slaves are hooded, in order that they do not know who it is with whom they are forced to mate, lest they might, in their moment of union, in their common degradation, care for one another or fall in love. The largest number of slaves, however, larger than the bred slaves considered as a group, are those who have been born free and have fallen into slavery, a not uncommon fate on this cruel, warlike world, particularly for women. Slave raids are a major business, and from time to time a city falls. Slavers are angry, incidentally, when a city does fall, for then the market is likely to be depressed for months due to the influx of new slaves, sometimes numbered in the thousands. The slavers, by the way, indulge in speculation and manipulation wherever possible, trying to anticipate changes in fashion or control them. I suspected that the house of Kernus was attempting to create a need for barbarian girls, if only to add a variety to a rich man's pleasure gardens. Girls of a sort seemed it could supply in numbers not possible to competing slavers. The major obstacle to this plan, of course, was that barbarian girls tend to be ignorant and untrained. On the other hand, such girls might be trained, and I suspected that Kernus might have in mind some such experiment with Elizabeth. The house of Kernus, which is a broad, many-storied cylinder, has a number of facilities which any large slave house must have. The only difference between these facilities in the house of Kernus and such facilities in other houses would probably have been in size, numbers of staff, and lavishment of appointment. I have already mentioned the baths in the house of Kernus, which can rival some of the pools in the gigantic Carpathian baths, the finest of known Gaul. Less impressive, perhaps, but even more essential to the operation of the house were its kitchens, its laundries, commissaries and storerooms, its medical facilities, in which dental care is also provided. It has corridors of rooms for staff members, all of whom live in the house, its library, its records, it has files. Its cubicles for smiths, bakers, cosmeticians, bleachers, dyers, weavers and leather workers. It has wardrobes and jewellery chambers, town cots, 2 of them opening by means of vast portals to town perches fixed on the side of the cylinder. There are training rooms, both for slaves and for guards, and for those learning the trade of slaver. Recreation rooms for the staff, eating places, and of course various pens, kennels and retention facilities, as well as a chamber in which slaves are processed, collared and branded, deliveries to the house of Kernus. Deliveries both of foodstuffs and materials and slaves are frequent. It is not unusual that 100 slaves be received in a given day. The total number of slaves in the house at any one time, a shifting population of course, tends to be between 4,000 and 6,000. Many of these, of course, are simply put in pens and retained there until removed for sale. Some lots are wholesale to minor slavers, usually coming in from distant cities to pick up merchandise, which tends in R to be abundant and on the whole reasonably priced. R is the slave capital of known Gaul. Although there are some private show and sale rooms in the House of Kernus, and private auctions and exhibitions intended to interest prospective clients, most slaves of the House of Kernus and others are sold in one of the 5 public auction houses, licensed and taxed by the administrator of R. The major auction house, the Curalian, contains a great block. It is a great mark of prestige among slave girls to be selected for sale from the great block in the Curalian, and the girls tend to compete viciously among themselves for this honour. To be sold from the Curalian is almost a guarantee of a rich master and a luxurious pleasant life, though it be of course only that of a slave. As at many of the larger markets, there are musicians near the block, and a girl is often given enough time to present herself well. In the minor blocks in the small houses, or even the minor blocks in the Curalian, sales are conducted with a swiftness and dispatch that gives the girl little time to interest and impress her buyers, with the result that even a very fine girl, to her indignation and shame, may be sold for only an average price to an average buyer, who may use her for little more than, as it is said, kettle and mat. This type of thing is at its worst when large numbers of girls must be sold, as when a city has fallen. Then, stripped, chained by the throat, in a long chain of girls, each separated from the other by about 10 feet, secured not even by the dignity of a collar, but only by a loop of the communal chain bolted or padlocked around her neck, each girl is dragged up the steps of the minor block, bid upon while a 1 sand clock is turned, and she is sold to the highest bidder that comes forth in that 1 She is then dragged down the steps on the other side, making room for the next girl. "This is the best of our private auction rooms," said Ho-Tu. I looked into one of the private sales rooms of the House of Kernus. It would seat no more than 100 buyers. The tiers in the room were of marble. The room itself was draped in rich purple. The block itself, interestingly, as tradition required, was rounded and of wood. On its surface there was sprinkled, again one of the conventions of Gorean tradition, some sawdust. Female slaves, incidentally, are always sold barefoot. It's good for the girl to feel wood and sawdust beneath her feet, it is said. I was a bit sad as I looked at the block. I knew that in such places private auctions were sometimes conducted discreetly for flavoured clientele, many of them slavers themselves. At such private auctions, conducted secretly, Gorean slavers sometimes find it convenient to dispose of important, high-caste women without trace, sometimes even from the city of R itself, perhaps women who have lived proudly, luxuriously, not more than a parsang or two from the rounded wooden block from which they now find themselves, to their horror, being sold. Who knows what women, freshly branded, hooded and braceleted, chained in the slave wagons, pass to and from R. Passing down a corridor trailing after Ho-Tu, we stopped briefly to peer into a large room. In this room I saw 2 slave girls clad in yellow livery with yellow collars, as Elizabeth normally was, and they were kneeling opposite one another. One girl was dictating from the piece of record paper held in her hand, and the other girl was copying it rapidly on a second piece of record paper. The speed with which this was done informed me that some form of shorthand must be being used. Elsewhere in the room there were some free men, Scribes, I gathered, though they were stripped to the waist, who were inking, using a silk screen process, large sheets of layered glued rag paper. One of them held the sheet up, inspecting it, and I saw that it was a bill which might be pasted against a public building, or the public boards near the markets. It advertised a sale. Other such sheets hanging on wires proclaimed games and tarn races. The common thread in these various matters was that the House of Cairns was involved, either in presenting the sale or in sponsoring the races or games. "This may interest you," said Ho-Tu, turning down a corridor. There was a door at the end of this corridor, and 2 guards posted. They recognized Ho-Tu immediately, of course, and unlocked and opened the door. I was much surprised when I saw, about 4 feet inside the door, a second door. In this second door there was an observation panel, which slid back. A woman looked through the panel, saw Ho-Tu, and nodded. In a moment I heard 2 iron bolts being withdrawn, and we entered another corridor. I heard the door being bolted again behind us. In the corridor we passed another woman. Both, interestingly, wore long, rather graceful white gowns, and had their hair bound back with bands of white silk. Neither had worn collars. "Are they slaves?" I asked Ho-Tu. "Of course," he said. We saw another woman. We had not yet seen a man in this corridor. Ho-Tu turned to a side corridor, and we found ourselves, to my surprise, looking through a huge rectangle of glass, some 12 feet high and perhaps 15 feet wide. It was one of a dozen of such panels I could see in the corridor. Beyond the glass I looked into what seemed to be a pleasure garden, lit by energy bulbs radiant in its lofty ceiling. There were various hues of grass, some secluded pools, some small trees, a number of fountains and curving walks. I heard the music of a lute from somewhere. I stepped back, for I noted, coming along one of the curving walks, 2 lovely girls, clad in white, their hair bound back with white silk, and they were quite young, perhaps less than 18. "Do not fear," said Ho-Tu, "they cannot see you." I studied the glass that separated us. The 2 girls strolled near the glass, and one of them, lifting her hands behind her head, studied her reflection gravely in the mirror, retying the band of silk which confined her hair. "On their side of the glass," said Ho-Tu, "it seems a mirror." I looked suitably impressed, though of course from Earth I was familiar with the principles of such things. "It is an invention of the builders," said Ho-Tu. "It is common in slave houses where one might wish to observe without being observed." "Can they hear us?" I whispered. "No," said Ho-Tu. Now one of the girls laughed and pushed the other, and then turned and fled, pursued by the other, also laughing. I looked at Ho-Tu sharply. "There is a system of sound baffles," he said. "We can hear them, but they cannot hear us." I regarded the 2 girls running off. Beyond them I could see some others. 2 of them were playing catch with a red ball. There seemed to me something strange about these girls, though they were beautiful. They seemed in a way simple, very childlike. "Are they slaves?" I asked. "Of course," said Ho-Tu, adding, "but they do not know it." "I don't understand," I said. I could see now the girl playing the lute. She was lovely, as were the others. She was strolling about one of the pools. 2 other girls I now saw were lying by the pool, putting their fingers in the water, making circles in it. "These are exotics," said Ho-Tu. That expression is used for an unusual variety of slave. Exotics are generally quite rare. "Well, in what way?" I asked. I myself have never cared much for exotics, any more than I cared much for some of the species of dogs and goldfish which some breeders of Earth regard as such triumphs. Exotics are normally bred for some deformity which is thought to be appealing. On the other hand, sometimes the matter is much more subtle and sinister. For example, it is possible to breed a girl whose saliva will be poisonous. Such a woman, placed in the pleasure gardens of an enemy, can be more dangerous than the knife of an assassin. Perhaps Hu guessed my line of thought, for he laughed. "No, no," he said. "These are common wenches, and though more beautiful than most." "Then in what way are they exotic?" I asked. Hu looked at me and grinned. "They know nothing of men," he said. "Oh, you mean they are white silk?" I asked. He laughed. "I mean they have been raised from the time they were infants in these gardens. They have never looked on a man. They do not know they exist." I then understood why only women had been seen in these rooms. I looked again through the glass at the gentle girls sporting and playing together by the pool. "They are raised in complete ignorance," said Hu. "They do not even know they are women." I listened to the music of the lute and was disturbed. "Their life is very pleasant and very easy," said Hu. "They have no duties other than to seek their own pleasure." "And then?" I asked. "Oh, they are very expensive," said Hu. "Normally the agent of an Ubar who has been victorious in battle will purchase one for his high officers to be brought to the victory feast." Hu looked at me. "The attendants, when the girl is purchased, give her a drug in her food that night and remove her from the gardens. She is kept unconscious. She will be revived at the height of the Ubar's victory feast, commonly to find herself unclothed in a cage of male slaves set up among the tables." I looked back at the girls through the glass. "Not unfrequently," said Hu, "they go mad, and are slain the following morning." "And if not?" I asked. "Oh, commonly," said Hu, "they will seek out a female slave, one who reminds them of the attendants in the garden, and this woman will comfort them and explain to them what they are, that they are women, that they are slaves, that they must wear a collar, and that they must serve men." "Is there more to the House of Kurnus?" I asked, turning away. "Of course," bowed Hu, leading me from the area. One of the women looked at me as I left and smiled. I did not smile back.